The United States of America represents a unique example to the world. It is what happens when a defeated enemy is not completely banished from the country where they inspired a civil war. The enemy was allowed to remain, treated as the brother they had always been, and the reason for the fighting allowed to be glossed over for the sake of peace. During this alleged peace, the side that lost remains bitter, treacherous, conniving, and always on a path to win the victory they set out for initially. Instead of using swords and bullets and tanks, they use a different tactic. Nothing can convince future generations the way the written word can. Control the narrative, and you control the population. Control the population, and they will demand you send them to their own deaths to maintain your lives. Our word of the day is propaganda. The pen is mightier than the sword. You see that logo? It signifies the strength of the written word. What I try to do on this show is research out of ignorance and not out of pride. A journey that started almost 15 years ago, but the foundation of good research began in elementary school. One of the main issues that I have with modern journalism is we fail to use primary sources. It is easier to grab a soundbite from an alleged expert, yes, if you have access to those alleged experts. But for someone like me who is not seeking and currently lacks access, using the basic tools of research overpowers those audible grabs of opinion. Being first has never been synonymous with being correct. Being popular has also never been synonymous with being correct, and neither word shall ever be. A few tips on basic research. Google, Wikipedia, those should be your starting point, not your end. When perusing articles or sites, look for their sources, if any are listed. Citations are important. If they are merely rewriting someone else's research, go to that person's research. Find the source of the information. I want you to be able to chart your own course and come to the same information that I disseminate here. I don't want to be your sole source of information. I want to be a conduit of facts. Now, why am I telling you this? Because deceiving you matters more than telling you the truth in our modern era. Everything has a political lean. What you eat, whether or not you should want a raise, whether or not you support a clean environment, and as has always been the case, what you should be taught. Critical race theory talks about how laws are based in race, laws as passed by legislative bodies comprised mainly of white men, no matter what their European ethnicity is. It is not racist to read to you what they wrote, such as the first naturalization law signed in this country by George Washington. It is not racist to read to you what the Confederates wrote in their own Constitution. It is also not racist to tell you that these states passing laws to make sure whites do not feel guilty is something they have always done. Before I dive too deep into the words of the recent bills, let me ask you, has there truly been a time when these lawmakers were concerned about how black children would feel about the education they receive in school? Hispanic children? Native Americans? Consider this. From Alaska to the tip of Argentina is the American continent. But which country calls its citizens American? If we're going to talk about divisive labels, conservatives are proud of that label. Brazilians are also American. Argentinians are also American. On a side note, those countries have a history of wiping out natives and slaughtering slaves as well, but I digress. Let us consider a different label for ourselves. USAan is one that comes to mind. Statesian, I don't know. But the entire Western Hemisphere is comprised of Americans. Trinis are American. Panamanians, Canadians, all American. And once again, When has their collective government education systems been concerned about adequately representing black people or Native Americans? But they have always made sure those minority groups learn how to respect whiteness. One of the criticisms conservatives love to mention is that leftists and liberals banned books in Nazi Germany. Well, banning books is exactly what conservatives champion when supporting legislative bills in more than 20 states in a battle against critical race theory. Now, before I continue, let me clarify. There are very few progressives or leftists in this country, and some of those alleged liberals bandy the term so much that they may as well be called conservative too. That having been said, are conservatives implementing the tactics they want us to believe are the tools and innovations of progressives? Conservative means to keep what has always been or what was here before. Therefore, the notion that we need to change the history we have been taught falls under the conservative mantra, believing nothing that exists is ever wrong, that the systems as they currently are have no ill will or detriment towards the grand populace, because the society in control has convinced you that there was nothing untoward being presented in the lessons. In order to maintain the fallacy, you have to control access to a limited supply of alleged knowledge, a double obstacle. Take Texas, for example, when a state lawmaker had a ready list of more than 800 books that should be banned from education because they make some people uncomfortable. That, allegedly, is a liberal tactic. The law that allows that man to present that list of books also allows schools to present an alternate theory of the Holocaust, that supposed era when alleged liberals mistreated Jews. Now ask yourself, why would a conservative want liberals treated in a fair light? Your answer, because it was actually conservatives who mistreated Jews. They wanted Germany to return to an era of economic success and German pride before they were infiltrated by Jewish people. The problem, when can they exactly pinpoint the Jewish influence began? And how did Jewish people control a country that was run by non-Jews? On a related note, some of the same ostracization the Jews faced in 1930s Europe, they currently implement against Palestinians in the Middle East, but that is a discussion for another time. From oppressed to oppressor, just like any assimilated minority in this country. But I digress. The conservative education in this country wants to be able to treat both sides fairly, whatever both sides might be in their definition, because that is the lesson many of them learned as children. To be fair, the stated words of the law in Texas, which went into effect the 1st of September last year, does condemn any lessons that make any race feel superior to another, allows for teaching about Jefferson and Sally Hemings, the Federalist Papers, and a few other texts. But teachers are not allowed to teach current events without giving deference to multiple perspectives, ad infinitum, I reckon, because it does not state how many perspectives are allowed to be presented. It does outline that lessons should not include concepts that, quote, an individual, by virtue of the individual's race or sex, bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. An individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of the individual's race or sex. Meritocracy or traits such as hard work ethic are racist or sexist, or were created by members of a particular race to oppress members of another race. The advent of slavery in the territory that is now the United States constituted the true founding of the United States, or, with respect to their relationship to American values, slavery and racism are anything other than deviations from, betrayals of, or failures to live up to the authentic founding principles of the United States, which include liberty and equality. In other words, you are not allowed to teach language that makes black children feel uncomfortable either. Yet, rewriting and mistelling history does exactly that. If we recall from when we went through the history of the Daughters of the Confederacy, venerating some people has always been the tactic. Therefore, expect their descendants to never want education that exposes why Jim Crow was created, why the Confederacy seceded. They are fulfilling the stated purpose of their parents' organizations. The bill making its way through Florida includes a very similar language, including it under unlawful practices, subjecting any individual to believe any of the following concepts constitutes discrimination based on race, color, sex, or national origin. An individual's moral character or status as either privileged or oppressed is necessarily determined by his or her race, color, sex, or national origin. Members of one race, color, sex, or national origin cannot and should not attempt to treat others without respect to race, color, sex, or national origin. Let's pause right there, because the state of Florida currently sues the Biden administration for releasing so-called illegal immigrants into the Sunshine State. So this law on paper already condemns mistreating illegal immigrants, at least in how you educate students about them. Now back to the legislation. Such virtues as merit, excellence, hard work, fairness, neutrality, objectivity, and racial colorblindness are racist or sexist, or were created by members of a particular race, color, sex, or national origin to oppress members of another race, color, sex, or national origin. And if you do decide to teach these lessons, you must provide it in a, quote, objective manner without endorsement of the concepts. Included in this legislation is physical education requirements based on sex, not gender. It also says that members of particular underrepresented groups need more representation in education, sort of a contradiction to the creation of this legislation. It goes on to mention that the only things allowed to be discussed regarding the history of this country is generic, quote, universal principles. Now, to get even more confused, it specifies how the Holocaust needs to be taught. And get this, folks, because according to the state of Florida, we cannot talk about prejudice and racism when it comes to slavery and how black people were treated in the United States because it might make some people uncomfortable. But in the section about the Holocaust, quote, be taught in a manner that leads to an investigation of human behavior, an understanding of the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping, and an examination of what it means to be a responsible and respectful person for the purposes of encouraging tolerance of diversity in a pluralistic society. And there are countless black people who champion ignoring our own history of oppression for the sake of only talking about how the Jews were oppressed. Funny how the United States wants to be able to tell us how other countries mistreat without telling how we mistreat. And are Germans allowed to be offended by how the Holocaust is taught at a school in Florida? Because the legislation already stated that race and national origin are not allowed to be integral parts of the lesson if it is going to negatively affect the mental capacities of those individuals. And why are we allowed to mention race when it comes to Jews, but not when it comes to black people? So many questions. But remember, thanks to the Compromise of 1877, former Confederate states were allowed to treat black people any way they wanted to treat them, ushering in Jim Crow. What will get even more confusing is when we take a look at the language in the legislation making its way through Harrisburg, how a former Union state can sound just as discriminatory as any former Confederate state. The influence of the Daughters of the Confederacy is far-flung. Next time, Off the Top.